Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at different types of government. Remember, a government is any institution that makes and enforces law. Remember that every government has three powers: the power to make law, the power to enforce law, and the power to interpret law. And remember that a state needs to contain four things: territory, population, government, and sovereignty. And our focus on this one is basically, in general, the types of governments that revolve around this, mainly whether they are more free or less free. And whether or not a government is free is often stipulated by the actions of its body of basic laws, and that is the Constitution. A constitution is any basic body of laws, and most countries have some sort of constitution within it, and it's usually considered the supreme law of the land. The same thing that exists here in the United States. The United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land, where everybody, regardless of position, has to abide by it. In our Constitution, just like in any other, what you will find is a couple of things. First, you'll have, who has the power to make, enforce, and interpret the law. In a dictatorship, that's going to be like one person. In a party like the People's Republic of China, it'll be the Chinese Communist Party. In the United States, the power is supposed to rest within, ultimately the people, and then the people elect or appoint these people. How much power does the national, regional, or local governments actually have around your countries? And how do you actually change government or change this thing called a constitution? And finally, if any, and the thing that made the U.S. Constitution unusual is it actually said what were the rights of the citizens of the country, that they had specific rights that were protected from government intervention. That was what was really specific to the Constitution. So we put governments into two different spectrums. We have authoritarian governments, and authoritarian governments are types of governments where there's more authority over people's lives. They get much more involved in what happens in terms of people's free speech, expression, whether they can be searched, whether they have any rights with police, um, any kind of like overall the values and freedoms and liberties of the people. Authoritarian governments are going to be more involved in what that actually means, and government involvement in people's lives. That's usually going to be your dictatorships, your total monarchs, your oligarchs, and your theocrats, your theocracy. Okay, that's going to be on this side of the spectrum. The more free are going to be your direct representative democracies and constitutional monarchies. Now, understand that not all authoritarians have been hated throughout their history. You have some Middle East, like Prince Mohammed Maktoum of the United Arab Emirates, very popular. Vladimir Putin, early in his first 10 years, was really popular. Um, Queen Victoria was very popular. You can make him look dictator. This is a dictator right here. Bashar al-Assad of Syria. They make him look like a father. Propaganda does all kinds of things, but those are usually the worst of the worst. Now, people like to say democracy is simply rule by the people, and we need to make that definition different because people can make really bad rules and hurt other people. So, what we want to say is a democratic government is where officials are chosen by free and fair elections with constitutional limits on state power. So, the government, first of all, we choose people on free and fair elections. They're not corrupt, they're not on occasion, they can't be canceled or delayed. And the people that we elect actually have limits that are listed in the fundamental documents on what the state, the government, can actually do to the people. So we have people that are put into power by free and fair elections, and their power is actually constrained. It's limited. Okay. Now, there are two types of democracies. We have our representative democracy, where the people elect representatives to actually vote and make, enforce, and interpret law. And then we have direct democracy, where people actually have a vote on everything the government does. It's the direct vote of the people in terms of law. And now, what type of government is the United States? Well, actually, in theory, both. There is, of course, more primarily a representative democracy because we elect our elected officials to do things, but we also do have direct democratic values in the state and local governments where you vote on actual laws that occur. Okay. Now, people will sometimes say that a republic is not a democracy, and that's wrong. The power is still within the people. They elect people with their power constrained by a founding document or a constitution. Now, if we take a look at a couple of different things, in democracies, you'll have rule of law. And this means the law applies to everyone, regardless of their position in government. Laws apply to everyone. When you're an authoritarian government, you have rule by law, where the government ends up deciding who's the law actually apply to and at what level. And if the government's making that decision, it's probably not going to hold itself accountable. In democracies, you have a free and fair media who give plenty of different opinions and coverage of ideas and everything else. In an authoritarian government, the government actually influences the media, attacks the media, or controls the media outright. And when you're seeing the governments really try to manipulate the media, that's a form of an authoritarian tactic. In a democracy, you have free, fair, and consistent elections at very regular intervals. Authoritarian governments have elections, but they're not free. They're not fair. They're often government manipulated, or people are coerced, meaning intimidated or manipulated by violence and fear and that kind of thing. Governments are transparent in a democracy. This is where people actually get to observe everything that happens with government and actually are involved in the process of governing. In an authoritarian government, you don't have that transparency. It's usually only a notable few get a say or any kind of view about government in action. And it's only going to be the authoritarians that are going to make the choices. In a democracy, people participate actively in government. While in authoritarian governments, you have a limited role of participation by the people. Sometimes it's a big act. Sometimes it's only certain people that you want to be like nationalistic and prideful. Sometimes it's just the people are afraid, so they go participate in government because they fear retaliation or anything like that. Okay. So the primary differences between democratic and authoritarian governments, obviously, if you're having a slide toward authoritarianism, the things you look for are less fair or competitive elections. Any attempts to cancel or delay elections is bad news. If the government is censoring media or limiting any kind of opposition groups or political parties from participating, if there's only a single party in existence that can be voted on, or a group is dominating and like has multiple parties, but they all control under one group, or if there's any kind of intimidation or corruption of government officials, this is a bad sign that you're slipping from a more democratic to a more authoritarian regime. If you're becoming more democratized, then what you're going to see is more free, fair, consistent elections. You have an engagement in a transfer, a peaceful transfer of power, like when you're flipping presidents or political parties or ideologies. There's no violence, no nothing. It's just a peaceful transfer of power. The allowing of a free media, okay, that's definitely a more democratized country. Pluralistic, meaning that of many different views. If you have a pluralistic political society, pluralistic parties, pluralistic ideas, different ideas and parties and news, that's good for a democracy. When you have greater rule of law, when everybody's held accountable from the top to the bottom to follow the law, and of course, civil liberties are for the citizens. Certain basic freedoms that the government can't just on a whim decide to get rid of. These are a movement towards a more democratized, democratic country. So we have our democracies over here, our direct democracy, representative democracy, and constitutional monarchy, our less free dictatorship, monarchy, oligarchy, and theocracy. If we have our spectrum here, we have our free, partly free, and not free countries, our standard North Korea, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, Cuba, Iran. More free, Sweden, Norway, Canada, Japan, and Chile. Okay, so identify the difference between a democratic and authoritarian country, get a good idea of what really democratic and really authoritarian countries actually look like, what to look for when countries seem to be becoming more or less democratic is also super important.